Okay, now we're recording. Thank you. Okay, so we'll go back to the code in terms of creating the component, and we'll go ahead and add the loading mask, the alert messages, and adding support for remote paging. So we go back here, and just to summarize what we worked on last time, we added the constructor where we initialized the state. We also performed a disk binding out of all of the methods that we have within the component itself. We performed an API call within the performSearch method, so you can see right here. We also went on ahead and added some handler functions for when we're adding an input to the form fields and for handling all the navigation bar selections. Lastly, we went to the render. We initialized some of the properties that the reusable components will use, so for fields, the columns. And then within our return statement, we added our card, in which the card header contains our navigation bar. And then the card body contains the grid component and the form fields. So we'll go ahead and add the loading mask. So we'll add the loading mask within the grid component, or we'll wrap the grid component with the loading mask. And the way you do that is you use a reusable component called loader component, which just contains two properties, whether it's loading and also just the content. So the content we already have, we'll just go ahead and move this inside. And then whether it's loading or not, we just need to add a loading mask. So show loading mask variable. Since this isn't in the state yet, we'll go ahead and add that in. So if we go back to the constructor, we'll initialize it to false. And then lastly, we want to have access to this variable within render. So we'll go to the render and add it here. So now we have access to this variable, which will be initialized to false. What we want to do next is anytime that we make an API call to perform the search, we want to set this to true. And the way we do that is we go to performSearch, and we can do something like this. This.setState. Show loading mask, set to true. And then on the second parameter, we can actually add a callback function. And we'll wrap this whole thing we already have onto there. So now what's going to happen is that anytime we perform a search, we're going to set the state to show a loading mask. That's going to go ahead and skip over to render, show the loading mask, and then it's going to call our callback function, which just performs the API call. The other thing we're missing is that after we make the API call and after we get the response, we want to go ahead and turn off the loading mask. So the way you do that is to show loading mask set to false. And then same here. Okay. So now if we go ahead and save it, and we go back to our component and we perform a search, you'll see that a loading mask is appearing, although it is unaligned, but we can fix that. So now every time we do a search, it's always going to show a loading mask. Now the other thing we want to go ahead and add is anytime we do a search, we want to block this out. And the way we do that is we go back to the form fields component and we use a property called disable all fields. And we can just wire that in to be looking for the show loading mask. So now if we go back, you'll see that the fields are disabled. Another thing we can do on top of that is just to make sure that the user is completely prevented from doing anything as the API calls getting made is to actually disable these as well. So to do that, you just need to access the nav link, and there's a property called disabled. So just wire that in as well. Try to search again. The whole thing is disabled. So now we have a working search component with the fields getting disabled and also showing a loading mask. So the next step we want to do is we want to add the alert message. And actually before that, let me go ahead and fix this. I've discovered what the issue was. I mistakenly typed text as the property when we want the type. So now it's fixed. So now let's add the alert message. The way to do that is within the card body, just above it, we'll go ahead and add show alert message. And if we do have show alert message set to true, then we want an alert to show up, which will come from React Bootstrap. We want the variant to be danger so that it's going to be red. And then we want to pass in whatever message we want. So alert message. We want to go ahead and initialize these as well to the state. So show alert message false alert message. And then we want to add it to the render so that it has access to it. Show alert message and then alert message. Just divide this out so we know. Okay. So now every time the show alert message is set to true, we will show an alert message. In terms of setting these to true and also adding an alert message, you just need to go onto here. So whenever we perform a search, if you remember, we were doing a validation to check that the user actually typed in something, or that the only form field data isn't just the scope type, which is our default. We want them to also add other input to the search. So we already added that block on there, but then now, as you can see right here in the else statement, if that check fails, then what we're doing is we're showing an alert message. And then the alert message is going to come from sustainment strings, which should be always where your strings needs to come from. So if you trace through here, you'll see that this is the message. Please enter a search criteria. So let's go ahead and save. If you were to do a search and we left it blank, you'll see that an alert message appears. So the other thing is, let's say an API call fails right here. We want the error callback to also show that something went wrong. So as you can see here as well, we're setting the alert message to true, and then we're passing in an alert message, which is just this generic search form error. Something went wrong while retrieving grid data. So for us to test this out, we can actually set this thing to fail. So the search authority is a post request we can make it fail by making it a GET request. So now if we go back, we were trying to do a search, put in some values here so that you can bypass that criteria check. You can see that our alert message is finally showing up. And you see the API call failed. So that's good. Now, if we want to go ahead and align this, I will show you guys a trick real quick. You'll right click, you'll do inspect, and then you can actually revise the element style. So right now, we don't have a margin on the top. We can go ahead and add one. So margin top, we can do like 5px, or maybe even 10. The bottom is too much, so we can do margin bottom and get 10px. That's too much as well. We'll just do 0. So now it's more centered. Now this won't actually transfer into your code, of course, so this is just a way for us to know what the values that we need to put in so that it's more centered. So we'll just remember that margin top needs to be 10, margin bottom just needs to be 0. So if we go back here and go to our alert message, right here, you can access this property called style, and you need to do double braces, and we need to do margin top, and it needs to be single word, not like this. So margin top, we were doing 10, margin bottom, we were doing, so if we save and go back and we try to trigger it again, it's more centered. So that's how you fix that. Last thing, actually, let's program the reset first before we work on the paging. So reset is straightforward. We just want to clear the form. We also want to hide any alert messages that shows up. So let's go back to the code. Let's go to where reset goes. So it's an event queue reset, which we haven't added yet, actually. So we'll just go to the handler and add a new case. Case reset. So we want to this.setState. And what we want to do is just, we want to reset to how things were in the initial state. So the way to do that is just to go back to the initial state, and you can just copy most of these over. This may not be applicable, but we can remove that once we paste it in. So like this. Loading mask doesn't need that. So now anytime we hit reset, all the search results rows will be erased. The form fields data will be reset to the universe again, and then we'll hide any alert messages. Break. There you go. So now save. If we go back and we fill all of these in, and you do a reset, this whole thing will just reset, and then we'll just go back to universe, just like that. And then for resetting the search results, we can perform the search. And actually I need to fix it again because I made it a GET request. So let me go back to my API call and get a post request again and do our search. Okay, now we have search results reset. So you can see even this got cleared up. So that's how you code the reset. The last thing with this component we want to do is do the remote paging, because it's not going to do that right now. And the way to do that is we go back to the grid component, and there's a property called remote paging. right here. We want to set that to true. Now, there are other requirements when it comes to remote paging, and the way you can find that out, what the required properties are, is if you go to the React Wiki, if you go under GridComponent, and you go under paging, they'll tell you for remote paging, we need total count, current page, change current page. So all of these properties we need to have, and it'll give you a description of what exactly these are. So we'll go ahead and add those in. So total count. We'll just create a new state variable called total count, and we'll do that in a moment. Current page. So current page, we'll also just create that in. Change current page. We'll be passing in a current page, whatever the current page is that GridComponent has. And for consistency, it's passing it to the parent so that the parent knows what the current page that the GridComponent is looking at. So what we'll go ahead and do is we'll just set the state for this current page right here to just be the same. Now there's two ways to go about setting the state for this current page. You can either do this way, which may be more common in terms of like what you see in terms of pattern, but with JavaScript you can actually just do this, and it's going to know to save it under this variable name, whatever the value is for the current page. We want to go ahead and add as well current page size, and lastly change current page size, which will bear the same idea as here. And that current page size, we want to set the state current page size. Now, the other thing we want to do is whenever we change the page size, we should always set the current page back to 0, just so that whenever the user expands their search to be from, let's say, 10 results, make it 25, we want them to go back to the first page. So the way we do that is we just change the current page to 0 again. Okay, let's go ahead and add these in. So total count, current page, and current page size. So if we go back to the state, we'll initialize those again. Total count 0, current page 0, current page size, we can set it to 25, just so that it's a larger search results. We want to have access to those in the render, so we'll add those in here as well. Total count, current page, and current page size. So now these know to reference from the state. The other thing you can do with the grid component, so let me just save. And if we go back to the web page, we can make this into even more. So instead of showing just 10 search results, we can show it so that it shows 25, and then maybe 50 or 100, and or also add more options for like 200 or something like that. The way we do that is we use this thing called the page config, where it's an array, where the first one is just whatever the default page size is, and then the second one is the array of page size options. So let's go ahead and add that in. Page config. The first one is going to be whatever our current page size is. Current page size. And then the second one is whatever options we want to give. So 25, 50, 100, 500. So if we hit save and then we go back, you'll see that you have 25, 50, 100, 500. And you can even add more. So let's say, just for your example, for instance, they want to have 1,000 as an option. You'll see that 1,000 is there. Okay. So now we need to program our, we need to also have it so that whenever we change the page and change the current page size, that it triggers the search. So we can utilize the second parameter of the setState and just have it call this .performSearch. We'll do it for both of these. So that now every time we change a page or we change a page size, we want the grid to refresh and perform a search again. Okay. So now if we go under perform search, if you guys recall yesterday, I just manually put this in, but then now since we have all this information, we can just add them in. So total count. Let's see, current page size. And actually total count we don't need. So the current page will be here. The size will be the current page size. Let me see. Oh, sorry. Current page times current page size. And then the limit is the current page size. So we want to limit our search results to just whatever the page size is. The current page to be whatever our current page is. And then the size to be our current page times current page size. So now we're passing that the information in, but then the thing we're missing is that for the grid component, it also needs to know what the total count is. And it's not going to be enough to just use whatever the rows response will be, because that is being limited by whatever the current page size is. But our total count is the overall results of the search criteria. So what we'll do is we'll do an asynchronous call for two asynchronous API calls that we'll call at the same time. So the way we do that is we can make an array and we'll call it API configs. The first one, we'll add the URL, which we can just reuse what we have. We also need to have the request type, which is a post request. We'll pass in the request data, which is our post data. And lastly, our response model, which is we already have right here. The other API call we'll need to make is to get the size. So if you look under the search, if you guys remember, I've had you guys create a separate one for the size. Now that's what you'll use. So search authority size is using this method. So if you go back, search authority size, it'll also be a post request, same post data, except we don't need a model because it's just going to return an integer. So now we need to change this API call. Instead of using post, we use a thing called all. So let's see. For all, it needs, for the first value is the API configs. For the second, it's the success callback. So if you look at all The first parameter is the API configs, which is our array. The success callback will actually be returning back an array of our responses, depending in the same order of the API configs. And then the error callback is if anything fails with one of those API configs, API calls, it's gonna call that. So with that in mind, we need to change our response and call it response array. Now, the first response array, the first element will be our first API call, which retrieves the search results. The second one is retrieving the size, which we'll assign to total count. So response array 1. There you go. Okay. So now we save that and we go back to the grid. We do a search for able. So you can see authority size, it returns that there's going to be 62 total. So GridComponent already configured itself so that it's going to go up to 3 pages. And since we're only allowing 25 per page, then for 62, it's going to have 3 pages total. So if we were to click next, it's going to perform a search again, and it's going to pass in that we're starting on the second page, and the page starts from 0. So yeah, we're going to go to the second page, and then the third. It's passing in the page like that. So now let's say the user wants to view even more search results. They can go up to 50. And it's going to show the 50, and you can see that it was set back to 0, or the first page, which is what we handled before. So if we go to the second page, it's going to show the rest of them. So that is our completed search form component that we've made from scratch, and it's all just a component version of it. So now we'll go over React hooks, and we'll recreate our search component. And after we recreate it, we'll do a compare and contrast just to see what exactly are the difference. So if we go here, and we'll save this aside, we will create a new component in the view folder. We'll create something called search form hook.js. Okay, got it. Okay. So the hook, to initialize the hook, rather than declaring it as a class, you're actually going to declare it as a function. So function, whatever the hook name is, it's going to receive props. And then we're going to export this hook so we can use it. So within this hook, it needs to return. And what it's going to return is whatever we want to display. So for now, we'll just return the div, and we'll change that over in a little bit. We want to go ahead and create the initial state as well. So we'll do constant initial state. And we'll set that as an empty object for now. We'll also go ahead and retrieve the state and then retrieve the setState method. And the way to do that is we do const state setState equals useState. And we'll pass in our initial state. Another thing that you'll need for a hook especially if it makes an API call, is useEffect. And then we can add the dependencies as a second parameter. So this is the general structure of a hook. And as you'll notice, there's no constructor, there's no component did update or component did mount, and there's no render statement. So where do you find those? So for the constructor, so there's no explicit constructor method. The way you initialize your state is just performing it this way. And the component did mount and component did update are actually combined under useEffect. And the way that you're able to trigger them is using the dependencies, which passes in which you'll pass in an array of variables that useEffect will keep track of. And any changes within any of those variables, it'll trigger useEffect again. And then the render, there's no explicit render method. You're just returning. So whatever you return, that is essentially what the render return statement. So just to make it easier to distinct and find, we'll comment that out and we'll make this to be the render. And we'll go ahead and import what we worked on. So for the return statement, get rid of this for not distraction. So for the render, we want to render the navigation bar, the alert message, the form fields component, the divider, and ultimately the grid component. And as you can see here, there's the return statement, right, within the render. That's essentially the same idea for a hook. So we'll just copy that over and go here. So now we have navigation bar, alert message, and everything else. We also need to go ahead and reinitialize all of these as well. So to do that, we'll start off with initializing the properties. So the form fields, so all of these things just above the return statement, we'll just copy over. Like that. Now these state variables, we also need to go ahead and add in to our initial state. So the way we do that is we go to the initial state object that we had, and we can go ahead and start initializing it. Since we have it already from here, we can just copy those over. And this other information is how is it going to retrieve from the state? You need to, under the render, we'll do constructor, constant. And all of these variables, form fields data, rows, show, loading mask, all that stuff. We have that from here already. So just to ease process, you can copy that over as well. And then rather than calling this .state, we actually just need to do state like this. And it's going to take it directly from this variable right here, which is using the useState. So now we have all the variables for the state, because I'm not complaining anymore. The other thing we need to fix is, or the distinction between a component and a hook is, whenever you call setState, you no longer need to call this .setState. You just need to call setState. So we can remove that. Same thing for method calls as well. and we'll fix the methods in a moment. So setState. With hooks as well, you have access to the prevState right then and there because it passes it in as a property, as a parameter. So if you want to get the prevState, you can use it to manipulate how your new state will be depending on prevState. So let's say you want to increment something, you have access to the prevState object. So you could do that. But for our purposes, we don't need it. So we'll go ahead and just pass it back, prevState, and we just want to change the current page. There's also not a second callback function parameter for setState, so we have to actually get rid of these. So setState, prevState, prevState. Okay. Let's close that. Okay. So like I mentioned earlier, also in methods, you don't need the this anymore. So we can go ahead and get rid of those. And then we'll create the nav selection constant again. The method again, and then same thing goes for the form input. So we can put that right above here where we have our divider. We can just label it helper methods. And we'll have an arrow function. So constant handle form input, which would pass in name value. And same thing goes for handling the nav selection. Event key. Like that. Okay. So we already have these filled in, so we'll just copy those over for the sake of time. So for the handle nav selection, and then for form input. Okay. Get rid of this. For setState, we need to pass in the prevState and pass it back. Same thing goes here. performSearch. I'll show you how this thing changes in a moment. prevState. Okay, that about covers most of the issues it's having. Now we just need to handle whenever it calls performSearch. So another difference with hooks is that when it comes to API calls, there's no way for us to do something like constant performSearch and like do an API call here. The way we make API calls in a hook is we're actually forced to use the useEffect. And how do we go about triggering the useEffect? Well, we can do setState, show loading mask, and set it to true. prevState. prevState. And what we're going to do is anytime we set the state and we set loading mask to true, it's going to go render that loading mask, and then it's going to bounce back to useEffect. So if you guys recall from yesterday, the React life, the component lifecycle, what we're doing is we're calling this.setState. We're calling setState, We're going to render. And with components, the way it worked was that it would go to component did mount, or it would go to component did update right after that. But since we're in hooks, the next step after it renders, it's gonna go to useEffect. And since useEffect combines both of these, the way we can trigger the API call is by having the variable be changing. So we go here, we had the variable for show loading mask set to false. Now what we did was when we want to perform a search, we're setting it to true. So it's going to do the render, show the loading mask, and it's going to go here. What we want to do is we want to trigger the API call if show loading mask is set to true. And what we'll also do is add it as a dependency, so you can keep track of this variable show loading mask. So now inside of here, we'll make our API call, which we already have. So we'll just copy that over. We'll replace all the this.setState. Add the extra parentheses, close it off. And now we have it so that it's gonna watch out for that loading mask. And if it's set to true, we'll do API call. We'll get the response. And after we get the response, we want to show the loading, set loading mask set to false again. So after it calls this as its state, it's gonna go back to the render. It's gonna show our rows and total count. And loading mask will be set to false. And so if it goes here again, which it will, it's going to say, okay, if setState set show loading mask, we'll see that it's finally false. It's never going to do this again. It's going to do it one time. So in terms of using useEffect and making API calls, having variables is your only way to trigger it. Okay. So this is our component version, and this is our hook version. So right off the bat, like I mentioned earlier, there's no constructor. There's also none of these binding the this with the methods, and there's no this.state. It's as simple as just referencing the state directly. And for initializing the initial state, you have to make an object initial state and pass it to useState. Another thing the difference is that when we do performSearch, or when we make API calls with a component, we can put it under a method and use this trick where we can trigger it to set the state first before it performs the API call. But with hooks, we have to use useEffect strictly and trigger it using a variable. And tracking that variable, we need to add it as one of the dependencies in as an element in the array for dependencies. In terms of everything else, like these methods, you just have to use arrow functions like this. And then there's no explicit render method. So you just have to have some sort of like a comment just so you know where the render starts. And then it follows the same idea with this importing the state variables, but you just don't have the this. So that is the main distinction between the hook and a component in terms of our code so far. And now if we want to go ahead and go back to the presentation, what's the difference? So to summarize, with hooks, there's no need for this binding on methods. So you don't have to call this.performSearch. And on the state, so you don't have to call this.state. to access any of its properties. You just call state directly. Within the useEffect, you also need, it also combines the component did mount and did update. So you need to use that for both. It omits the constructor, and typically hooks are smaller and just more readable. So when should you use one over the other? So for components, if it's something that requires multiple API calls, just use a component, because we're able to actually separate them out into methods. So performing search, I can't think of any other functions, maybe like generating a report, you can add it as a separate method. But with hooks, you're stuck to using the useEffect. So I advise that you use hooks only if you have fewer API calls, so up to 2. Because otherwise it's going to be a little more difficult to manage after that with all the variables you need to track. With components, you also want to use it only if you have like multiple views within a single view. So for tabs, and for hooks, it's only managing a single, only if it's a single view. So for Popup content, which you guys have worked on with your task. So code-wise, I'm going to take a look at this, when to use this versus this. We can go ahead and look at what Kiran worked on. So if you look at the web page, requisition search, creating a shipment request, you can see how very complicated this is. This is just a component because you have all these tabs and you have all these views under these tabs. This will be a component because it's going to be more difficult to manage this over a hook. So let's see the code. So create shipment request view, and you can see it's a component. And you can already see how large it's already gotten, like 440 lines. So I advise that you use a component for something complicated like that. So as you can see, even the state is like, yeah, so it's better to use a component on that. In terms of a hook, we can go back to the web page. And we can take a look at requisition search, creating Mills Delms entry. Select one of the rows. You can see this is as simple as a search form, or rather an input for specifying stuff for the Mills and Delms file. And then you also have just a grid. So this view itself is just a hook. So we go back here, create Mills Delms. You see function, create Mills Delms. The state itself is shorter than the other one. You also have just one API call for retrieving the downloading the Mills and Delms file. And yeah, it's generally just shorter. Although it is almost the same length, but I think for what Kiran's working on, it's going to get longer since it's not completely done. So yeah, so ideally use hooks if it's just a single view, and use components if it's multiple views. Okay, so the last part, and I know that we're going over time right now, so if you need to leave, feel free to do so, but I'll go ahead and go over some examples. So one of the, or most tasks that you guys have worked on involves like showing a pop-up or perhaps downloading files. I'll go ahead and go over how to add that in. And then we'll use hooks to perform the download file or showing the content for the pop-up. So let's go ahead and do that. Close this file out. close this out. And we'll go back to the component that we worked on from the very beginning. And then we'll add those in. So first one we want to do is we want to perform a download. So let me just fix this real quick and go back to the component. We look at the web page. We'll go to here and do a performSearch again, just so that we can get the rows. What we want to do is we want to make it so that if you click on one of these, it creates a summary report for this given row. And how do we do that? We do that by using a property called TableCell. So for the grid component, TableCell, if you're going to look at the information for it, you can go back to the wiki. Should be under styling. Right here, TableCell. So it gives you an example. What it passes in is your row, column, and then the rest of the properties. So you just want to do the same thing. So TableCell, you want to add a callback function, row, columns, column, and then the rest props. And what we want to do is we want to return the tables cell. And table is going to come from DevExpress. So we'll import that table from DevExpress Bootstrap 4. That's the styling we're using, Bootstrap. So if you go back to the table, we want to close this out for later. And I'm changing it to parentheses so that it just returns this element directly. Because if you were to use braces, you have to have a return statement. But if you want to bypass that and you just want to return the object or the element, you just change it to parentheses. So TableCell, we want to pass in the rest of our properties, because all we're doing is we're adding an OnClick. So OnClick. So upon clicking a TableCell, let's see, if the column that we're looking at is, our target is the, look at the web page again. It's not showing. Okay, our target is one of the third column, right? So authority number. So we want to just pass in the authority number, and it's a property under name. So go back here. If column name equals authority number, then we want to perform a download of a file. And the way we do that is we'll use a hook. And to use that hook, we need to render it within the parent component. So our target is to have it be appearing onto here. And we'll use the same strategy as we did for showing the alert message. So this same format will do the same, except this will become our hook. So to do that, if column name authority number, then we'll set the state so that it shows download, show report download, hook, set it's true, and then we'll need to pass it the row that we're changing. So selected row. The other thing we're missing is we need to add a styling so that the table cell will appear as if it's clickable. So we just want to do the same thing again with if column name is authority number, then we'll show a certain styling. And the way we do that is actually not a callback function. We're just changing the style. So if for the cursor, if the column name equals authority number, then we'll show a pointer so that we know that it's clickable. Otherwise, we'll leave it blank. And to do that is we just call it undefined. We'll do the same thing for the color, and we'll change it so that it shows blue. And then the text decoration so that it shows as underlined. Now, since we're setting the state on these two, we want to go ahead and initialize them onto the state. So we'll just copy those over, go back to our constructor, and add them. Port hook, set it to false. Selected row will just be blank object. And now if we go back here, in the render, we need to have it so that it has access to those new ones we just created. Selected row. Then ultimately, we need to add it here so that it checks the criteria. So if show report download hook is set to true, then we want to show our hook. And for almost, or if not all, of the hooks, they're all contained under the SearchServicesController. So if you look in that controller, you'll see that some of them has download authority search file, which returns a hook, or another one, download feedback search report, which returns a hook. So that's how you can access the hooks to perform downloading or getting the pop-up content. But for our demonstration, our target is downloading authority search file. And just to take a step inside real quick. So for downloading authority search file, you see it's a hook. Within that hook, we're passing in the file type that was selected, the row data, and the reset callback. And the gist of it when it comes to downloading files and creating a hook for downloading files is that you make your API call. And within your API call, it's going to return the blob of the thing you want to download and the response. And within the response, you can, under the headers, you can get the file name, which you're going to set to the file object. Within the render, the return statement, you have access to that file object, and you'll use a library called saveAs, which is coming from FileSaver. So it's going to perform the download. It's going to pass in the blob and the file name. You'll see in the browser that it's going to trigger for download. Reset callback will get called. And our target to reset callback is to hide this hook again because we already finished the download. And then we'll just return an empty array, which is the same thing as returning nothing because we already performed the download using saveAs. So there's not anything we need to return. Unless something fails with the file object, then we can return a pop-up, which will have an error message. So if you ever need to create a hook that needs to download, you can use this as an example, or even easier, you can actually use, if we go back to the controller, if we just look up download, the other one we saw earlier was feedback search report. And this is a smaller version. So it follows the same deal. API call, get the blob, file name, and it renders. So you can use both of those as your guide. So now if we go back to this component that we worked on, we just want to go ahead and import that hook. So SearchServicesController dot download authority search file. And just for readability, we can put this in the next line. We'll be passing in the first parameter is the report type, which is going to come from sustainment strings, search services, authority file. We'll do a summary report. So instead of typing in this, we're just accessing it directly so that it's consistent within the hook and then within our parent component. The next one is we're passing in the row. So selected row. And then lastly, we're passing in a reset callback, which our target is to hide it. So we'll set show report download hook to false. So we'll do that by this .setState. Show report download hook, set it to false. And then we'll also import this over. So if we hit save and we go back to the web page, if we do a search, you'll see that all of them are clickable now. The other ones aren't. And if you click it, it's going to show our hook, which has a loading mask downloading file. And after it performs the search, you see it triggers for download. And if you were to view that file, it has a report. You can try another one, does the same thing. And as you'll notice, if it goes away, the way it's doing that is it's calling the reset callback, which we had set to hide the hook. So that's why it's going away and out of view, because it's already triggering the download. So that's how you add the download feature to a table cell. In terms of the navigation option for doing this, it follows the same idea for the OnClick in terms of setting the state. You just won't have to target the column and showing like revising the styling so that it's clickable or anything like that, because it'll just be a nav link. And after that nav link, you click it, you just want to trigger this. So let's do that real quick. So we'll add a nav link, event key, report, disabled, same thing, show loading mask, add an image real quick, report image, and then we'll add our label, which is just gonna report. We need to import the image again. The way you do that is you can just add it here, report image, and we'll just do a PDF because it's downloading a PDF file. So icon PDF, like that. We also just need to add it to the handler. So case report. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it's the same concept for the OnClick. You're just going to set the download hook to show. And then the selected row, for the sake of the demonstration, we can just take from the rows of the state and just take it as the first element within that response and break. So you see the report is right there. If we do ship able performSearch, we do a report, it's doing the same thing. So that's how you go about adding it to the nav options. But then one thing with selected row, how exactly will we have access to this rows? Well, there's in the grid component, or more than likely, whenever you're in this page, you'll have to select rows before you perform report, right? And in terms of selecting the rows, there's a feature within the grid component where you can allow for selection. Toggle select, and you would just set that to true. And you can even add things like show select all if you want to allow, or select all, allow select all, and set it to true. But if you want to find out what these properties are or what else you need, again, it should be in the wiki. But for this demonstration, we can just remove those. The last thing we want to do is show a pop-up. So for showing a pop-up, we can go back to the TableCell, because more than likely for showing, or I'll show in both places, in both the TableCell and the nav options. So we'll just comment that out, and we'll just change the behavior. Instead of showing the report download hook, we'll show setState, show pop-up, and set it to true. And then we'll just use the same selected row so that we can pass that selected row to the pop-up, and the pop-up hook can take care of the rest in terms of the view. And onto here, we'll replace this with a pop-up component. So as you can see, it imports the properties that are required. And we can also do show property, so that show pop-up, you'll keep an eye on that variable. You can add a header. We can say like edit authority number or something like that. The content, again, same thing as this one. We want to pass in a hook so that the hook can take care of handling the content. So for this demonstration, we can just borrow from the SearchServicesController, and for simplicity, we can do the create receipts, which is get a create receipts view, which we'll pass in the rows array and then a pop-up callback, like that. We need to call it, so we'll pass it the selected row, and then we'll just give it the callback function again, where it will just hide it. So this setState show pop-up set to false. Same idea for when we're closing it. You just want to pass that in so that it closes the pop-up when you click the X bar in the top right. Now we just need to initialize this. Show pop-up false. So that's been initialized, and then we'll go to render. Show pop-up. Now it has access to that. So to show it real quick, go here, you can do another search. If we press it, it'll open the pop-up, which this itself is the content of the pop-up, which is a hook. But the edit authority number, that's part of the parent. So that's how you go about adding a pop-up. And then you'll see the close on here works. Same thing for this one, which is what the pop-up callback calls to. That. So, and then just to do it real quick for demonstration purpose, we can just have the report show a pop-up as well. Again, same idea. We just want to set the state to show a pop-up. So let's see, this one right here. It's the same idea. We'll show pop-up. We'll get the selected row, but in this instance, we'll just take it from the first row, first row of the results. And if we go back and perform a search, it'll show a pop-up. And within this pop-up, it's actually going to pass in the first row. Even though this one's not using it right now, it will pass it to the hook. So that's how you go about adding a download feature, pop-up feature in both the table cells and the navigation options. And we use that using hooks. So that is the end of the presentation. I went over 20 minutes, so I apologize if you're still here. But at this point, if you have any general question, or if you have any questions that you want me to go over, please feel free to ask me now. But otherwise, thank you so much, guys, for staying if you're still here. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Lord.
You're welcome. Thank you for staying. Feel free to drop off if you guys don't have any questions. I'll just wait until everyone leaves to make sure.